first thing I noticed was the smell. Walk-in coolers have a particular cold that gets into your sinuses, and after 16 years of standing in front of them at 4 in the morning doing temperature checks, I knew exactly what 41 degrees Fahrenheit felt like on the back of my throat. That morning, standing in the receiving bay of the Kamloops distribution center, the coolers smelled fine. Everything was fine. That was the last morning. Everything was fine for a long time. My name is Ray, and for 16 years I was the operations coordinator for a mid-sized grocery distribution company out of British Columbia. We supplied about 230 independent grocery stores across the province, plus a handful of co-op locations in Alberta. Dairy, produce, frozen goods, dry goods, anything that needed to move from a supplier's loading dock to a store shelf by Tuesday morning, I was the one making sure it got there. Not the trucks themselves, not the drivers. Me and my spreadsheets and my routing system, and the 16 years of knowing which Highway 1 connector floods in April, which Kamloops receiver starts his shift at 5 instead of 6, and which Surrey driver is going to call in sick every third Friday in November because he's got a hunting lease up near Williams Lake. I built that knowledge the same way you build anything in operations, one crisis at a time. The 2019 atmospheric river that closed the Coquihalla for 4 days, and we still got dairy to 47 stores within the window. The cooler unit that died on a truck somewhere between Hope and Abbotsford in August, and we rerouted the load and saved a full pallet of yogurt because I knew the receiver in Chilliwack would take an early delivery if you called him personally. Nobody teaches you that stuff. You earn it. The company was called Ridgecrest Supply, and it had been family-owned since 1987. The owner, a quiet man who wore the same style of plaid shirt every day and remembered every driver's kid's name, had built it from 3 trucks and a handshake with a produce co-op in Vernon. By the time I started, it was already well established. By the time the private equity firm out of Calgary bought it, it was the kind of company that ran so smoothly, people forgot it took effort. That's the thing about operations done right. It disappears. Nobody calls to say the milk arrived cold and on time. They only call when it doesn't. The new ownership brought in a vice president of logistics. He flew in from Toronto, which should have been my first signal. He had an MBA from Rotsman and a LinkedIn profile that described him as a supply chain transformation leader. He took one look at my routing system, which I had built in a combination of Excel, a custom access database, and about 300 hand-typed notes in a shared drive folder, and he made a face like he'd found something unpleasant on the bottom of his shoe. "This is very manual," he said. "It works," I said. "It's not scalable," he said. I didn't argue. You learn after a while that arguing with someone who has decided your 16 years of functional evidence is actually a liability is a waste of time that could be spent updating your routing notes. He brought in a consultant team from Vancouver about 6 weeks later. 3 people, all under 35, all very enthusiastic about a platform called ClearPath Logistics. It was an AI-powered routing and supply chain management system, cloud-native, built by a startup out of Waterloo, Ontario. One of the consultants, a young woman named Felicity, who wore noise-cancelling headphones around her neck like a lanyard, told me ClearPath had machine learning optimization at its core and would eliminate the inefficiencies of legacy tribal knowledge. I wrote down tribal knowledge in my notebook. I circled it. I asked how many distribution operations ClearPath had been deployed in at scale. Felicity said they had 3 active clients. I asked what the largest was. She said about 40 trucks. We had 231. I said that out loud. She smiled and said the platform was architected for enterprise growth. I nodded like that meant something. What I did not know yet, what I found out later from the accounting coordinator who sat 3 desks away from the VP's office and had very thin walls on her side, was that ClearPath's founder was the VP's roommate from his MBA cohort. They had kept in touch. The VP had mentioned during a quarterly review with the Calgary ownership group that he had a solution that could cut our labor costs by reducing headcount in operations coordination by, and I am quoting what the accounting coordinator told me, up to 60%. The ownership group, whose primary interest was in trimming the company for resale in 3 to 5 years, had approved the ClearPath contract the same week. I found all of this out after the fact. At the time, all I knew was that the VP had scheduled a meeting with me for a Thursday in February, and when I sat down across from him in the boardroom with its view of the truck yard, he told me that effective the 1st of April, my position was being restructured. ClearPath would take over routing and coordination. I would be offered a severance package in line with my years of service and the relevant provisions of the BC Employment Standards Act. He was very professional about it, very calm, used words like transition and phase out and appreciation for your contributions. I sat there for a minute looking out at the yard where I could see one of our reefer trailers idling, and I thought about the fact that I had personally renegotiated the maintenance contract on that trailer's refrigeration unit the previous spring, saving the company about $800 a year. I asked him one question. I said, "Are you planning to run ClearPath in parallel with my system for a period before the switchover?" He said there would be a 2-week parallel period in March. 2 weeks? For a system handling 230 grocery stores across 2 provinces, most of them with tight delivery windows, many of them in mountain corridors where a reroute at 2 in the morning is not a hypothetical but a Tuesday. 2 weeks. I signed the severance paperwork on a Friday. It was a decent package, 16 weeks plus the statutory requirements, which in BC is more than some provinces. I cleaned out my desk over a weekend. I took the binder I kept beside my monitor, the one with the handwritten notes about which stores had loading dock restrictions, which receivers had cell numbers that actually worked, which mountain passes had seasonal weight restrictions. I took that binder home, not out of spite, just because I'd written it myself and it felt like mine. I heard through one of the drivers I'd known for years, a man named Doug who ran the interior routes and texted me every Christmas, that the parallel period had been reduced from 2 weeks to 1. Then I heard from Doug again that ClearPath had gone fully live on April 2nd, 2 days after my access was cut. I was in my kitchen making coffee when the first call came. It was from the accounting coordinator, which surprised me, but she was the one who had my personal number. She said she wasn't supposed to be calling me. Then she told me that as of 6 that morning, 47 trucks in the Lower Mainland and Fraser Valley routing cluster had received contradictory dispatch instructions from ClearPath. 12 of them had simply stopped moving because the system had generated overlapping routes with no load priority resolution. The drivers were sitting in truck stops and staging areas waiting for someone to tell them what to do, and there was no one at the coordination desk because the coordination desk was now a cloud platform that was currently, in her words, doing something. I poured my coffee and I sat down. She called me back 2 hours later. The ClearPath support team was on a video call with the VP and the Waterloo founders. The system had been trained primarily on data from smaller regional distributors in Ontario and had not, apparently, been adequately prepared for BC Mountain routing parameters, the specific delivery window structures used by independent grocers in the interior, or the February-April weights restriction schedule on secondary highways in the Thompson-Okanagan. It was learning. It was learning in real time, with 231 live routes. By end of day, 23 deliveries had been missed, not delayed. Missed entirely, meaning the receiving windows had closed and the stores would not be restocked until the following morning at the earliest. I read about the produce spoilage issue on the 3rd day. One of the routes ClearPath had generated for a reefer unit carrying fresh dairy and produce to stores in the Okanagan had included a rest stop instruction that effectively left the truck idling in a staging area for 4.5 hours mid-route without human intervention to check on the cooler unit status. The cooler unit on that specific truck had a sensor that had been flagged in maintenance notes that lived in my access database, not in ClearPath. The sensor ran warm. By the time the driver realized and checked the back, the temperature had drifted enough that the dairy load was compromised. That was roughly $14,000 in spoiled product, and a store in Penticton that had empty dairy shelves on a Friday afternoon. I did not feel good about any of this. I want to be clear about that. I did not want the company to fail. I did not want the drivers to have bad days or the stores to be empty. I had spent 16 years making sure none of those things happened. What I felt, sitting in my house in Kamloops reading Doug's texts and the accounting coordinator's careful whispered phone updates, was something more like grief. The specific grief of watching something you built get broken by someone who never understood what it took to build it. The drivers started asking questions around day 5. Not to me, they didn't know I was gone yet, some of them, but to the dispatch line, which was now answered by an automated response system that directed them to a ClearPath portal. Doug told me one of the older guys, a driver named Bert who had been running the northern interior routes for 11 years, had called the main office number to ask about a reroute around a section of Highway 16 that was closed for emergency bridge work near Vanderhoof, and had been routed to a customer service queue for the ClearPath platform, where he had waited for 40 minutes before hanging up and making the decision himself based on his own knowledge of the road. Bert made the right call. Because Bert had 16 years of knowing that road too. The payroll issue started in week 2. This one I heard about from Doug, who called me on a Sunday evening sounding careful and quiet. He said that several of the contract drivers, the ones paid per route through the coordination system, had not received their payments for the previous week's completed runs. ClearPath tracked completed routes through GPS confirmation, but the system had a reconciliation gap if a driver deviated from the assigned route for any reason, including legitimate reasons like closed roads or receiver schedule changes. The system flagged the route as incomplete and held the payment pending manual review. There was no longer a coordination person doing manual review. The VP had not anticipated this. There were, Doug said, about 91 drivers affected. Some of them had mortgages. Some of them were calling each other trying to figure out what was happening. I sat with that for a while. I did not call the VP. I called the owner. Not the Calgary Equity Group, the original owner, the man in the plaid shirts who had built the company and who had sold it 3 years earlier, but who still, I knew, had one board seat and cared about the drivers the way you care about people you worked alongside for 30 years. He picked up on the second ring. I told him what I knew. I kept it factual, the spoilage, the missed deliveries, the route failures, the payroll gap, the number of drivers waiting on payment. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long would it take you to stabilize it?" I said I needed access to the routing data, a temporary coordination account, and about 72 hours. He said he'd make some calls. The VP did not call me. His assistant called me very formally to offer me a short-term consulting contract. The rate was reasonable. I said yes because I didn't care about being right. I cared about the drivers getting paid and the stores getting their deliveries. I drove to the Kamloops facility on a Wednesday morning. I had my binder. I sat down at a terminal and I spent the first 4 hours doing nothing but reading ClearPath's route logs, finding every flagged deviation, and manually clearing the payment holds on the 91 outstanding driver accounts. Payroll processed on Friday. 91 drivers got paid. 3 of them texted Doug to say they'd been about to call their union rep. I spent the rest of that week and the following week building a manual override layer on top of ClearPath, essentially a human-readable translation of what the system was trying to do, cross-referenced against my binder and the access database I had exported before my access was cut. I trained 2 junior coordinators, both of whom had been hired as platform administrators and had been sitting largely idle, waiting for ClearPath to need monitoring. I showed them the mountain corridor weight restrictions, the receiver contact sheet, the seasonal flooding flags on the Fraser Valley routes. I showed them how to read what ClearPath was generating and how to catch the errors before they became missed deliveries. ClearPath did not get better overnight, but the error rate dropped significantly in the 3rd week because there were finally human eyes on the output. That is not, I want to be clear, an anti-technology argument. It is an argument about implementation. You do not put an unproven system in charge of 230 live routes on day 1. You run it beside the thing that works until you are certain. You do not throw away 16 years of earned knowledge because it lives in an access database instead of a cloud interface. The Morrison Transport contract, one of our largest store networks, about 38 locations across BC and into southern Alberta, gave notice 2 weeks after the live launch. They cited the missed deliveries and the communication failures during the first 10 days. The VP tried to negotiate. They left anyway. That contract was worth, by the accounting coordinator's estimate, somewhere around $2.1 million annually. It was not recovered. That loss was real and it was permanent, and I think about it sometimes. I finished my consulting engagement at the end of May. The two junior coordinators knew what they were doing by then, and ClearPath had been patched with enough custom routing parameters that it had stopped generating the worst of its errors. It was not as good as what I had built. I am not sure it ever will be, in the way that matters. The intuitive, 6 in the morning, highway closed, now what kind of judgment that comes from years of doing the actual work. But it was functional. On my last day, Doug met me at the facility. He brought coffee in a Tim Hortons tray, 2 large double-doubles, the way we'd been starting early morning shift checks for years. We stood in the truck yard and watched the first morning dispatch roll out. The sound of reefer units cycling up, the backup alarms, the low grind of tires on the asphalt. It's not a romantic sound, but after 16 years it sounds like something working. "They're going to be okay?" he asked. "The two coordinators know the routes," I said. "They'll make mistakes, but they'll learn." He nodded. He looked at his coffee. "Should have never let you go in the first place." I didn't say anything to that because there wasn't much to say. He was right, and the people who made the decision knew it now, and knowing it now didn't change the Morrisons' contract being gone, didn't change the 91 drivers who'd spent 2 weeks not knowing if their pay was coming. What it changed was the company's understanding of what operations coordination actually is. It is not a cost center to be automated away. It is the accumulated judgment of someone who has been standing in a cold receiving bay at 4 in the morning for long enough that they know what 41 degrees smells like before the thermometer confirms it. I drove home on the Yellowhead. It was a clear May morning, the kind that makes the Thompson Valley look like it was put there on purpose. I passed 3 Ridgecrest trucks on the highway, all of them moving, all of them presumably where they were supposed to be. I raised 2 fingers off the steering wheel in the way you do for trucks, you know. I didn't go back after that. I consulted for a food distribution operation out of Kelowna for a while, and then a cold storage facility in Prince George that needed its routing rebuilt from scratch. Different problems, same fundamental truth. The system only looks simple to the people who never had to fix it at 2 in the morning. The VP left Ridgecrest about 8 months after I did. His LinkedIn said he had moved to a new role in supply chain transformation. ClearPath, last I heard, was still in use at the company, still running with the manual override layer I built and the 2 coordinators I trained. Sometimes Doug sends me a text when something goes sideways and he has to make the call himself. He always makes the right one, because he knows the road. I keep thinking about that binder. The one I took home when I cleaned out my desk, handwritten notes, tabbed by region, coffee stained on the Thompson Okanagan section because that's the one I pulled out at 2 in the morning more than any other. Nobody asked me to write it. There was no policy requiring it. I built it because I understood, somewhere along the way, that the work only holds together if someone is paying close enough attention to care about the details that don't show up on a dashboard. That's the part that's hard to explain to people who haven't done it. Caring about the details isn't a skill you list on a resume. It's closer to a commitment, the kind you make quietly over years without anyone watching. And the reason I was able to walk back into that facility and fix what ClearPath had broken wasn't because I was smarter than the consultants or more technically capable than the Waterloo founders. It was because I had spent 16 years choosing, every single morning, to understand the thing I was responsible for more deeply than I absolutely had to. That choice has a cost. It means staying late when you don't have to. It means building a binder nobody asked you to build. It means learning which receiver in Chilliwack will take an early call and which highway floods in April. Not because it's in your job description, but because you're the person responsible for what happens when it matters. There's an integrity in that. A quiet one, not the kind anyone gives you a plaque for, but the kind that means when 91 drivers are waiting on pay they've already earned, you're the person who knows exactly which payment holds to clear and in what order. What happened at Ridgecrest wasn't complicated, if you're willing to look at it honestly. A decision was made based on a relationship rather than evidence. A system was deployed without the judgment to know what it didn't yet know, and the people who suffered for it. Bert sitting on the side of Highway 16 waiting for a routing portal to answer. Doug texting me on a Sunday evening because drivers weren't sure their rent checks would clear. They had done nothing wrong. They had just been working inside a structure that had stopped respecting the difference between a credential and actual competence. I don't carry bitterness about it. I've thought about why, and I think it's because the outcome, in the end, followed logically from the choices that were made, theirs and mine. They chose to move fast without understanding what they were replacing. I chose to build something worth understanding. When the thing they chose failed, the thing I chose to build was still there, still true, still useful. There's a kind of quiet justice in that, not dramatic, not a moment of triumph. Just, the work holds or it doesn't. What I know now, having spent the years since consulting for operations that are usually in some version of the same trouble, is that the people who last, who actually keep things running when everything is going sideways, are not the ones with the most impressive credentials or the most confident pitch. They're the ones who have stayed honest about what they don't know, kept building their understanding even when nobody was rewarding them for it, and refused to cut corners in the dark when the easier path was right there. That's not a philosophy I read somewhere. It's what I saw in Doug every time he made the right call on a road he knew better than any platform ever would. The Morrisons' contract didn't come back. Some losses don't, but the trucks are still moving.